think it's time to get this started, guys. Clayton, Kast here, account director at Draft.dev. If you're not familiar with us, we help technically oriented agencies work on their technical content marketing programs from top to bottom. We're joined today by Ryan and Tom. I'm going to let you guys do a quick intro, and then I'll enter the topic we're going to be reviewing today. So how about we start you, Tom?
Hi, everybody. My name's Tom Williams. I'm a partner at Catchy. Catchy is a developer marketing agency based in Seattle and Bristol, UK. You can probably sense from the accent, that's where I'm from. I'm a strategic consultant by background, and what we do at Catchy ties very nicely to what we're doing today. All of our work is to help companies understand their technical audiences and how to engage with them, reach them, write the correct sort of content, campaigns, run the right sort of events. And that's the sort of consulting that I do and the great team at Catchy. Over my career, I've dabbled in content and marketing and product and client services, but I like to feel like I found my home in strategy, and I get to bring together all of those different disciplines, and they will play a part in what we're talking about today: content for technical audiences. Clayton, thanks for inviting me. Ryan, really happy to have this discussion with you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you. My turn, Clayton.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm assuming that was a tee up. Ryan, I run Content Lift. Don't get confused by the name. I'm not a content agency, but I do B2B and buyer market research. I've been marketing and business, really in B2B for 22 years. And what I try to understand with companies is how and why buyers buy, specifically how they think about other options in a market to solve a problem. Because my whole thesis is that if you understand that, then you can work with content agencies to figure out like what you need to be talking about in the market. So yeah, I've been doing that for the last 5 years, 22 years of marketing. And for the last 2 years, I'm teaching customer discovery at Incubator here in Ottawa, which is super fun. It's like in person. It's like a real person webinar. How's that for unique these days?
Right.
And that's a lot of fun too. So happy to share any of my experiences there.
Appreciate the intro, guys. As far as topics go today, so usually on these webinars, we do them monthly here at Draft.dev, maybe more frequently this year. We'll see. We cover anything related to technical marketing, developer relations, anything that falls in one of those two categories. And the topic of today is navigating diverse audiences in technical marketing. This actually came up the last time Ryan and I talked on one of these webinars with Tom's coworker, Gary, another very smart mind in our space, which is like, we say DevRel and dev marketing a lot, and I even try and strain away from that because there's a lot more to technical marketing than just developers. Depending on how you look at yourself, data science, DevOps, like security, like there's a lot that falls under that banner that we just cram everyone into developer marketing or technical marketing. And today we really want to get into the distinction there, because I feel it sometimes we don't do it justice. Like we speak of strategy towards this very diverse audience. It's not necessarily going to apply to everyone, or there may be intricacies that we need to consider when speaking to these different audiences. So we're going to talk about the diversity there in reference to our industry. So that could be type of technical company, type of technical position, seniority is what we're going to be focusing on today. So the way I always like to start these webinars, just for everyone here, we're going to discuss this for about 45 minutes, and we'll use the last 15 minutes for Q&A. Definitely make sure to take advantage of the Q&A functionality in Zoom. If you have any questions, we'll address them at the end. But I always like to open these up by sort of defining what we're talking about, right? So this is honestly, although a basic question, might be the hardest one, because we're labeling how would you define the different categories of technical audiences? There's lots of ways to approach this. I feel like this in itself could probably be a paper and not the question of a webinar. So let's maybe take our best stab at it so that we can define this a little bit and continue the conversation. Just off the top of my mind, like I've already said, you've got DevOps, security, data science, various branches of developers themselves. Then you've got like seniority and companies, like startups versus enterprises versus like open source. There's a lot of angles to take here. I'll shut up now. Who'd sort of like to take the first stab at this one?
I'll defer to Tom, and then I can sort of weigh in.
Yeah.
Okay. Clayton, I think you've hit the nail on the head in that there are so many ways to slice this cake. We could do it by coding language. We could do it by something we do quite a lot is motivation. So, for example, you might slice up an audience by motivations to explore or build or contribute to a platform, say. Typically at Catchy, we're doing a lot of work with large enterprises, and therefore I lean towards thinking about roles in decision making and day-to-day responsibilities, because that tends to lead into what messaging is going to land, what content is going to be most useful, what is that person trying to achieve. So back to your distinction of almost job titles, I found that useful. At its most coarse, we tend to see a 3-role technical audience model of sort of developer, technical decision maker, and business decision maker. I like to go a little bit deeper because you mentioned DevOps. There's some idiosyncrasies to that audience that are important to pay attention to, or engineering managers, but it maintains that model of thinking about enterprise hierarchy and decision making. So yeah, I like to think of it in a spectrum between, on the one end, let's say you've got developers, and at the other end you've got CTOs or senior technical decision makers, and in between you've got this sliding scale through DevOps and technical leads and engineering managers. And then once you've got those in place, you can start to think about, okay, what are their day-to-day responsibilities? How big is this organization? What level of influence do they have on buying decisions, etc.? So that's my starter for 10.
I could agree with you more. Like, the three of us have unique perspective that we have to worry about all the different specialties within each of these banners. Whereas if you're at an organization, what we would call client side, you probably already know what your specific area is. It's more so of is it an end user, is it a decision maker, where they fall within the company. How do you feel, Ryan?
Yeah, I like what Tom said about motivations. I have a bit of a different take on titles. Actually, that's not fair. How I look at titles is they're just the first layer, because they're often not a good representation of what people's tasks are, their motivations, use Tom's words. A title can be just made up in a business. It's just, and they do it all the time. And really, give you a good example. I just pulled it up now. I'm running a project now for a company. They've built a platform for MSPs to deploy Okta to multiple clients. And all the people I'm talking to, here's the roles, the titles: founder, VP, cybersecurity engineer, CISO in the executive branch, program manager, senior software engineer, project manager, and another senior software engineer. These are all the people that are involved in the decision to use this tool. So it's where do you start if you're just looking at the title, right? So you really have to start drilling into the things that Tom mentioned. Is what does the organization look like? Who's responsible for what? Are they responsible at sort of the operational level? Are they looking 3 years out as an executive? What are they doing? And that's where you really start to think in a sense of what type of technical buyer. Because if it's CTO, they'll still understand a lot of the stuff that the head of DevOps is going to be talking about. But what they are focused on is probably different things.
Yeah.
So, you really have to really dig into, when you're talking about the type of technical audiences and technical buyers, you can start at the title level and sort of take a general swath. But then your job as the market and sales teams are to start digging in further. What does that mean inside this type of organization?
I like that. We may continue on this motivation trade analogy introduced to topics. It does sort of help drive perspective here, because even a CTO at different size organizations is a very different individual. A CTO at a start is almost an end user. They're almost, versus a publicly traded organization that's much more of a managerial figure. Okay, let's talk motivations then. My next question was going to be, what are the key differences between, sort of how we categorize the group? So let's maybe define some of the common motivations that we see within the technical marketing space, so we can continue the conversation down that path. Does that make sense?
Who goes first? Me?
We're gonna throw you under the bus.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of ties into what we just talked about, like
Yeah.
how I do that is I like to sort of unpack how a company works and how a solution fits within the context of the business processes they're trying to improve. So what does that mean? It's a bit of a gobbledygook answer. But a really easy analogy is GitHub is not the process of development. It is one tool to aid the process of development, right? It hosts all your repositories. So I like to try and understand, how does this all fit into the mix? And in B2B, historically we talk about buying groups. There's different levels of involvement in those groups. How do they all fit together? And what is, to use the language that we were talking about earlier, is like, what are their motivations in each of those subsets? So, like for the project I just talked about now, I'm talking to one person that has a specific lens of like why they would not have deployed Okta before, and why are they deploying it now with this specific type of solution. That doesn't mean that there is someone higher up the food chain that understands the benefit of that, but they might have a different lens of like, why would that be important to them in the organization? Why do we choose that as a market option? I hope I'm answering the question, Clayton, but like you have to go and understand how they think and like how they approach their day to day, because that starts to unpack like, what are their goals in the decision making processes, because they look at it through the lens of what they do and how they affect the business.
You're answering the question. I feel like today is quickly going to turn into a conversation of how to define this for yourself versus maybe people actual definitions, because it's just too broad. Like which is, I think, the point worth making here. And is like you really got to figure out your own audience. Cool. What do you have to add there, Tom?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that whatever model we settle on in a vacuum, the minute you're talking about a specific context and a specific company, it probably needs adapting. And so therefore, like, everything I'm saying is got this heavy asterisk of, yes, but it might be different if I was speaking to an organization that looked different. I mean, we're talking about motivations. And so to try and briefly paint some of that picture, we're talking about motivations ranging from, getting a very practical task done in a long line of other tasks at the developer end of the scale, where what you want is something that's well documented, easy to integrate. I can get help when I need it. At the other end of the spectrum, at the CTO level, you're thinking about, is this going to fit in with our company growth goals? Is it going to fit our risk mitigation profile? And so, got this broad swathes of motivations. This is why when I start and I'm sure, Ryan, you're the same, like the minute I start a consultative engagement like this, I want, even if I've been brought in by one specific team, let's say that marketing has brought us in, I want to speak to all the other teams as early on in the engagement as possible, because they will have wildly different perceptions of who their users are, who matters most in this purchasing decision. And yeah, so even if ostensibly it looks like a bit of marketing work, you need that matrixed view from an organization of the audience profile to really paint that picture of the motivations.
Yeah. And if I may, like, I don't want to get ahead of our conversation, the dynamics of all those will look different on size of organization, geography. There's all these parameters that impact those types of things. And I always like to say, one of the things that people, if you don't do a lot of research around B2B, what is common in a lot of the research, and is common what I see, is that people mitigate towards their perception of risk. So you have to understand, what are the perceived risks that each of these people see, because the risks of using a market incumbent versus the risks of using a startup that's only been around for 2 years are dramatically different in the eyes of either someone who's a user, or someone who like is a VP that is now fighting for budget against other VPs.
Yep.
Because the money's coming out of one bucket, and they now have to put their part of the reputational line for an unproven vendor. And so all these things are happening all at once. And it's really in your best interest to sort of understand the dynamics of how all these things play out.
You teeing me up well there, Ryan. So next, I was gonna let's get into seniority and how that affects how you guys, I guess, build programs around audiences, right, or strategies. From my perspective, I far too often see or talk to organizations like, "Oh, we only top down," or "We only bottom up." And it's like that's just our binary. That's how we do it. Versus where I think it's much more intricate in that you have to speak to both and tackle them totally different. It's sort of like what you're talking about here, Ryan. Like from our content perspective, a build versus buy article is way different depending on if you're talking to someone in the C-suite versus an end user. Another vague question, but how do you approach the different strategies depending on where they fall in the company and what their day to day is?
Well, I'll let Tom go first since I went first last time.
Oh, good call. There you go. I think Tom's still there. We lost him on video. He may have had to sign out and sign back in. So maybe just be.
Well, then I'll pick up.
Right.
So
yeah,
both what you're describing is a common scenario. I think businesses think about or encounter. I've seen it over 2 decades, right?
Yeah.
I don't think either approach is wrong.
Yeah.
I think what happens though is either we get myopic into thinking one is the only way, or we discount, we don't often spread our thought process of like what can be. So what I mean by that is there's a company called Sneak, which developers will probably know. If I remember correctly, it's to really understand if your code is compliant or you can correct me if I'm wrong, Clayton. You might even.
You're right. Which, by the way, just DevRel in general, if you ever want to see someone who's really good at what they do, check out Sneak stuff. They go there.
Perfect. What I had heard a few years ago, and I don't know if this is true any longer, part of their go-to-market strategy was, okay, we're a product-led go-to-market approach. We're going to get developers to start using our product. And after we hit a certain critical mass, we will then reach out to the executive function or whoever's the head of X team. Hey, by the way, you have this many people using Sneak. It looks like you have a few paid licenses, a few non-paid licenses. Do you want to talk to us about group pricing? Well, why do you do that? Well, here's why, and here's why your team's using it. Here's what the value is. Like, so that's one way to do it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think how I look at it is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more, but often when you look at group buying dynamics, there's one person that we'd historically call a champion. Sometimes I say that's the person who has to build the business case about why should budget get allocated for this solution to improve X process in a business. They got to go to bat. They then have to convince different types of stakeholders, and you need to figure out what level of scrutiny and involvement each stakeholder brings to the table and how much do you have to cater to them. So sometimes that's at an enterprise level, you're helping the compliance and procurement teams figure out a whole bunch of different things. Sometimes it's just your champion is just getting a rubber stamp on a piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
So I think knowing the buying group dynamics around like how involved is a senior executive versus a middle manager or an end user, as you would say, is part of that. Because sometimes they play no involvement and it's just a sanity check. Or sometimes, again, if we look at how people evaluate things, oftentimes the first 2 vendors we pick are the ones that a company ends up choosing as the final vendor of choice. An executive might say, well, throw 2 more in there just so we make sure the prices are okay and we're not missing anything. It's a sanity check, right? You're a throwaway vendor. So is that what the VP is doing? Or are they in there with their sleeves rolled up because this is a significant purchase that's going to dramatically shift the operational nature of the company? So I think you have to understand how everyone plays together and how they see the impact of what they're buying.
Totally agree. Tom, welcome back. We're talking about the relationship between seniority within an organization and how do you speak to each individually, what that relationship looks like. Like Ryan had the great comparison of Sneak, fantastic at DevRel within our space, but they, like you said, sort of build critical mass of users at a large organization, and then they go to the leadership saying like, hey, look at all these end users already taking advantage of our products, and sort of roll from there. So lots of approaches. I'm sure you've seen a Catchy. Curious to get your take on this.
Yeah, I definitely. I'm sorry, I missed the part of that conversation. Definitely, yeah, organization scale. I think I might have missed a bit of context there, but yeah, particularly in roles where you've got a CTO if we're talking about a startup where a CTO might well also be a lead engineer or have been a developer themselves very recently, a core part of the engineering team. Very different dynamic to, if you're talking about a Fortune 500 company where all sorts of other parties, even beyond technical audiences, will be involved in decision making.
Yeah, that actually segues straight to my next question. So beyond seniority, then it's looking at company size and how that discussion continued to change. This one's a pretty big one. I feel like, on this question, the prep sheet I gave you guys ahead of time, I only clarified startups versus enterprises, but I feel like another big one in our space is the audience the organization themselves target. So are you open source or are you focused more on enterprise products? I feel like it's another big distinction here too. And that might be the more interesting path to discuss here, because that's two drastically different styles of marketing in my eyes. Tom, do you have any opinions on, I guess, open source organizations versus those that are trying to target larger companies?
Yeah,
actually, we're more the bigger fish.
Yeah, and they definitely most of the work that we're doing at the moment tends to be not open source, tends to be proprietary. But I'm thinking of a third distinction here, because we've increasingly been doing some work on internal DevRel, where you've got companies that have acquired several other companies over the years, and you end up with a need for internal DevRel, internal dev portals, internal dev marketing to foster a culture within a company. And so much of this isn't even visible to the outside world, but is where you've got dev teams that are thousands strong, plays a fundamental role in ensuring that everybody's got visibility into all of those different initiatives. So that's even not quite what you're asking, but
that's a great angle that I didn't even consider to think about, though. I'd be interested to hear more about how you guys are approaching that. That would be, I think, something worth diving into.
Yeah, well, a lot of the methods that we deploy look just the same as if it was an external developer audience. And obviously, there's one of the hardest things when you're doing developer-led research is access. And thankfully, when it's an internal DevRel program or developer marketing program, access to developers and data is that much easier.
Yeah.
So it does allow you to fast forward to some extent. But then acquisition is a completely flipped on its head, because there is a finite amount of acquisition, and you know everybody, you know every potential user there on their organizational CRM. So it's slightly different there.
Interesting. Right. What are the types of organizations you're usually working with? Or you just sort of have a healthy bag over there as far as, I don't know, like I said, we talk about proprietary versus open source. We could talk about size, whatever you approach.
A lot of what you're talking about is segmentation, right?
Yeah, correct.
And there's, for people who maybe don't even understand the history of segmentation, like we've been doing that since the Bronze Age. Like that's not like a new thing, but it's a helpful thing, and it's important because you start to sort of throw the dart in the right directions. And you can segment through vertical or industry. You can segment through, like I said, geography. There's titles, headcount, revenue, the different like tech stacks they have. Am I a Microsoft shop or am I a Google shop? Like those things matter too. Performance metrics, any types of key things they need to have, or how they measure success. So, like, the question around who I work with all sorts, but when I work with clients about helping them define market research, that's the list of things we go through to figure out who is the person we're going to talk to understand what we need to understand.
Correct.
Because if I want to speak about, again, like the product I'm running right now, I'm not going to speak to shops that aren't deploying Okta, because it doesn't make any sense, because they haven't put any value into that tool. Why in the world would I spend marketing resources to try and convince them to use Okta when I'm just a tool that supports Okta? Like, it doesn't make any sense. I want to go towards where the market is, where I have the least friction about actually turning someone from out of market to an in-market buyer. Like, that's the key thing for me. So when you're looking at all these things, like size of company, sure, is definitely one thing to look at, because a startup is going to be less risk averse, with less procurement scrutiny, over an enterprise company where you have, there are a Microsoft shop. They have 10,000 users across the globe. They have a dedicated procurement team, and, compliance and security are like paramount. So these are all things you have to weigh into how you market and talk about your product.
Our answers are continuing to go fall towards, I think, the most important talking point of today, which is, this is so broad and you have to get specific within what you're targeting. How do you figure out what you should target? Because no one's going to be able to walk away from today and say, okay, do this for DevOps, or do this for front end, and do this for security, or do this for startups, do this for enterprise. As the main point today needs to be like, okay, how do I go about figuring out what I need to do for my organization? So I think initially, when you guys start working with a new client, or say you just started your own company, you're starting from scratch to defining who is my specific audience, where are your initial milestones that you're aiming for to figure that out?
Ooh. Well, I'll tell you how I do it. I'm very curious to hear how Tom does it. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I always like to start with the person who has to build the business case, right? And I've run projects where users are actually never even involved in the evaluation of a tool, which is crazy. It's probably not so much in the technical world, because they need sort of, lift up the hood and check around. But it does happen. But who is on the hook? Like, who to use that word we had to begin, who has the motivation, who has the need, who has seen that X process needs to be improved. And that we start with that person, we build our knowledge center around that. And then I try to understand, their role, their responsibilities, the firmographics of the business, understand that process they're trying to improve, how challenges manifest in the process, buying triggers, right? Or sometimes we'll use a term marketing called category entry points, where it's like, because most solutions will fit in a category if you're following that methodology. So it's like, what category does the solution fit into? How do they build the consideration set? How do they evaluate the consideration set? And what are the dynamics of the buying group? So as much as things are broad, I follow that framework every single time, because the answers to those questions will be different based on all the things we talked about. Now, there are always going to be similarities, but I mean, a head of IT at a hospital is going to have different answers than a head of IT for a Fortune 5000 software company, depending on what you're going to ask them, because their worlds are different. So that's how, to your question, Clayton, like, that's the steps that I follow. But I'm very curious to hear what Tom does, because I might learn something from what they do.
My take on the question, or my response, is a bit more methodological. But I do have a common approach. Generally three-phased. I will go into phase one. I will go into a new consultative exercise and just be wide-eyed and open-eared, and try and gather data from at least 2, ideally 3 different sources. We've talked about one, stakeholder interviews. I will talk to sales and product and engineering and as many people within the organization as I can. Ideally, a second source is going to represent the user, and that's often the most challenging. But maybe I can do some developer interviews, user interviews, or there's the opportunity to do a survey, or there's some pre-existing research that's been done, or there is some reasonable proxy that I can use to represent the user there. And then if we've got time and budget to do so, I'd supplement that with social listening data. So go big on what are the conversational trends, what can I find on GitHub, on Stack Overflow, on LinkedIn. And so that's phase one. And the idea of that is I come in with a candidate list of 10, 12, 15 candidate personas. And then move into phase two, which is an audience prioritization workshop that I would run with the client. And this is a session, the goal of which is to come out of that with 2, 3 priority personas that then will flesh out in the way that you're describing there, Ryan. But to run that workshop, we need to go through all of those different personas that I've heard enough through that data to bring them as a candidate to this workshop. And now we're going to dig into those personas' goals, objectives, frustrations, and map those with the people in the room to the client's business goals, what they're trying to achieve, what their product market fit is. Hopefully out of that, you can settle on a smaller number. Let's say it's 3, a smaller number of priority audiences. Those are the ones that then we're going to flesh out into 3-dimensional personas with a much more tailored approach, looking at their specific role within different types of organization. But the whole of that has to be caveated that once I did this, and then 3 months after running that persona workshop, I went into the client office and they printed out poster size the 3 personas from our workshop, and which kind of made my spine shiver a bit, because nothing is ever done and dusted or should be printed and put in a frame. We need to be continually testing those assumptions, iterating them. So all of that answer is caveated by, sure, that might be right at that moment in time, but this is a very fluid endeavor. And so retesting your personas over time is also a key part of that.
Yeah, markets aren't static. And don't forget that. Like they shift and change. I just saw something in my inbox today from I'm in we're in the marketing world, right? So the MarTech people do the MarTech list every year.
Yeah.
And they just said, let's read to you now. They estimate with AI agents, the number of solutions is reached into the billions. Like, and I'm like, of course it has. So it's like, I say that because, to Tom's point, is those people that you now just framed on the wall have new ways that they're evaluating their options in a market now all of a sudden. So if you don't understand how their mindset has shifted with all these new options available to them, you better go figure it out quick, because that might have a serious impact on your business.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I feel like I'm paying you guys to queue up my next questions. I had next on my list like red flags you see a lot. That's already focused on. Tom probably really interested in AI stuff. I know he's been doing some of his own research in his professional life on that, specifically in the ethics around it. But some typical red flags we see marketers when they're segmenting out technical audiences. Honestly, the big one I see is sort of what you guys are already talking about, which is getting stagnant with it. It's always changing. And what I mean by stagnation is not necessarily like knee-jerk reactions to what you're seeing, but like you got to be measuring what you're doing somehow. You don't want to have death by numbers, but you also got to be able to have some idea whether it's qualitative or quantitative of what's going on, and how that's changing within your own organization. Yeah, Chris, see what you guys have to say. I forget who went first last time, so whoever wants to jump on this can
go for it, Tom.
Well, I'll go first. Closely related, a particular bugbear of mine is overgeneralization, which probably sounds ironic when we're talking about personas, because personas are necessarily a generalization.
Yeah.
But they're really useful. If you create an archetype, then you can start to think about motivations and behaviors and what sort of messaging will land. But if you rely too rigidly on that persona, that archetype you've created, then it is to assume universality, and then that is to assume that everyone is the same, and developers are humans too. And one developer who really likes to go deep into the technical documentation, another in exactly the same role with the same title and the same pay grade might prefer to walk through on a video tutorial or a webinar or what have you. There is no hard and fast rule. Humans are curious, interesting, diverse people. So I think just approaching this whole endeavor, yes, personas are really useful, but building in flexibility into our mindset and into our understanding of segmentation, and to the point, the conversation we were just having, continually validating and revalidating those assumptions, I think is a way to get the benefit of those archetypes without going too far down the overgeneralization rule, where you start to put everybody into a cookie cutter mold, and then you've kind of missed the trick. It's my biggest flag.
I always anytime I get into a new hobby, the way I judge who I should listen to is by the people that answer questions. But yeah, it depends. I don't really know. Like, anyone that gives you absolutes usually isn't truly a very knowledgeable source. And you guys are expressing your knowledge by your answers to be it really depends, man. You can't lock yourself into. I had someone the other day ask me how I qualify people for Draft.dev, what kinds of organizations we work with. I'm like, man, it really depends. There's not a hard and fast rule for it.
Well, it's because the business world's not a monolith, right? And,
yeah.
You need to understand the nuances of things. I would say generalizations is a key one. I wrote down assumptions, which is almost similar. One of the things I see a lot with when I'm doing the customer discovery course is people thinking that their lived experience is representation of the whole. And that sort of ties into the generalization side of things. But we even do that as marketers, where we often think the way that we look and how we evaluate and buy things will lead to how we should market and talk about things in market. And I don't think that's the case. Go talk to someone who is a marketing ops person versus someone who's a brand person, and what they are attracted to and how they evaluate solutions. You'll hear differences just in that, right? Because the marketing ops person is more aligned to the technical buyer's mindset, whereas a lot of us sort of creatives, we get seduced by the creative, right?
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the case. So you can't just sort of assume that your lived experience is going to be able to be replicated and be able to influence people. That's why I do what I do, because I look at things, instead of looking outwards from the inside out, I look from the outside in. Because buyers don't look at your solutions as just in its own, it's not isolated in a vacuum. Your solution lives across everything they can do to solve problem X.
Yeah.
So you have to understand their mindset around their vantage point, around what they can do. I mean, that's probably the other biggest red flag I see, especially when we look at personas, and I've seen so many. I built my own, it's on my website, Clayton, you've seen it.
Yeah.
For that very reason that I've never believed people do the depth of work they need to do to actually understand the decisions they need to make in the marketing and sales programs. It is just sort of a blanket thought process around, it's...
Man, I get to witness what you're describing firsthand almost every day. Working in content. It's
Irene, the IT lead, who, cares about disaster recovery. Great.
Yeah.
But where does she work? Why does she care about it? What is she doing for it? What's her RTO? Come on, man. So it's a lot of that though too is I think in the nature of B2B, I've seen over 22 years where we often forget the products just don't sell themselves. They live in the contextual nature of markets, but sales teams are used to having sort of that one-to-one binary conversation where it's either a yes or a no. So I think that sometimes colors our thinking as well.
Just in my own little world, we have this thing called revision purgatory, where we'll send an article to a client, and like head of marketing, head of growth, and then an internal technical expert will look at it, and clients will always be like, "Oh, we'll send this back to you, no problem. It should be quick. We'll get this published tomorrow." Those three individuals with different opinion within the same organization on a very, very basic top of funnel comment so significantly that that article never sees the light of day. And that's just a little microcosm of a bigger picture that you're speaking to there. It's definitely the case. We're down to like the last 3 or so minutes here. Trying to think of what we can answer quickly before we dive into this Q&A. Let's maybe chat on measurement a little bit more, and then we can head into Q&As. But how do you guys sort of? Because I feel like that's what keeps you from getting complacent. Is like, how are you continuing your research and continuing to keep an eye on the market day in and day out, and seeing when and how you need to make adjustments?
I can take that one since it's all I do. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways you can get information, and information isn't necessarily truth. So, you have to sort of understand what is important to you. What is the data information that actually you can trust to make decisions in the business? I'm not really answering your question, but I will in a sec.
I trust.
So I think you set the baselines of like, where do I go to, what do I need to learn, and where am I going to learn it? I use a lot of online AI tools now just for like what we would call desk research historically.
Yeah.
Perplexity, ChatGPT. I use this great tool called GigaBrain. It's a Reddit thread aggregator. And Reddit is like
I love that.
a marketer's dream. And if you don't use Reddit, you should. And what's really unique about GigaBrain is that it can aggregate queries of, or you can query it, and it can aggregate the data of other Reddit users and what they've said about different solutions and problems they have, or people are very honest and earnest in Reddit. And then you have to connect with your clients, like Tom said. It's not static. So you have to create a cadence around how often you do these things. And it'll be different for everybody in the depth of understanding. But, sending surveys out every so often to figure out if you want to know X, having conversations with your customers twice a year, create a panel of, we call them like customer panels often in B2B. They're focus groups in B2C historically. You have to create these environments where you dictate what you want to learn from these people so you can inform the decisions you need to make. I hope I answered the question, Clayton.
You definitely did. And like I said, this conversation, hopefully everyone understands, like, hey, you need to go home, do your own research. Like, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to any of these. It's just, first of all, that's just marketing in general. Second, this topic in particular, that's definitely going to be the case.
But I love how I'm sorry, I just want to add, listen to what Tom described as methodology from a few minutes ago. That's a great methodology to use, right?
Yeah.
To figure out how you fit in the generality. Sorry, Tom, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not at all. This is a fascinating conversation close to my heart, and I love that Clayton brought this in as the short 3-minute one that will fit in that little remaining gap.
Leave it to the sales guy.
Yeah, what I'd add to just build on from Ryan there is acknowledging, yes, once we've fleshed out our personas, probably we need persona specific KPIs, and acknowledge the fact that success for a developer audience might be, I don't know, engagement with documentation or your blog or API calls or forum participation, versus a tech lead, it might be downloads of a particular case study or an ROI calculator usage. So acknowledging that there isn't just going to be a single success measure. And once we've got that more nuanced understanding of our audience, we probably need a more nuanced measurement strategy to gauge our success.
I feel like that's a key point there, is like, it will be, I always call it death by numbers. Like, if you're just getting started, like, set yourself something that's easy to measure at first. And then as you mature as an organization and a marketing group, then you can start getting into the nitty gritty of like more refined MQLs and SQLs and who that audience is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's something that gets overlooked a lot. Yeah.
Too many companies, they overthink in the beginning. At the end of the day, if you're a challenger brand trying to get into a market, compete against other companies, really all you need to understand is figure out, are you people becoming aware of you? Are they adding you to a consideration set? And out of that consideration set, how many of your deals are you winning?
Yeah.
Right. And then within those three things, you're going to have different metrics like Tom that mentioned, right? Because maybe are they aware of you as like your case study downloads and API calls or whatever, right? So, but those are like the three buckets you really need to understand when you're thinking about marketing.
Totally agree. All right, we got a couple audience questions here. One from our own, Annick asking, we're talking about being stagnant. How often should marketers re-evaluate their strategy? Obviously, it depends on a lot, sort of like what we've been saying. But sometimes changing strategy too often can also be bad. Yeah, like that's where it's like the other side of death by numbers is like being very reactionary to numbers. Like, you don't want to be there's like a happy medium of being complacent versus being reactionary to, I guess, evolving your strategy. It's probably not a firm answer there, but curious to hear y'all's take.
If I may, I think it just depends on what the goals are of the organization.
Yeah.
Right. So are you launching new products? Are you trying to get into new markets? Is a competitor, are you seeing a competitor creep up on your heels? Has the total addressable market shifted? Well, one of the things I often say to people is like, what was the total addressable market of video calls before the pandemic? What was it during the pandemic? What is it now? Like, that's like that goalpost is always changing.
Yeah.
So, I think the executive teams, I think, who have a good understanding of like strategic direction will often have a sense of like, when should we evaluate what we're doing? But they don't always have their finger on the pulse of what's on the ground. And marketers, I think, are really in a good spot to understand like what's happening in a market.
Yeah.
It's in the name, So I think if you feel like any of the scenarios I talked about are maybe coming or starting to appear, that could be a way to adjust your strategy. I'm curious to hear what Tom thinks, though.
Yeah, I think that's a really eloquent response to the challenge. How often is the right answer? Depends on so many factors. Something that I'll add is we at Catchy use the language and culture of hypotheses a lot in our work. And so while your overarching strategic direction might not change, anything where, we've had to rely on patchy data or proxy data or 5 interviews to form an opinion, we will couch in the form of a hypothesis to be tested. Hypotheses are there to be proven or disproven. And I think people are a lot more comfortable with changes of direction when it doesn't feel like we're throwing out the entire strategy and starting again, but rather we are continuing to test this hypothesis, and occasionally you find some data that contradicts your hypothesis. And that's a great thing. That's progress, that's learning. So yeah.
We like with new clients, a regular conversation we have with measurables is always like, can you give us a ballpark of like the awareness drivers you'll get for us? Like, man, I would love to, but it depends on your org, what you guys do, the market you're in, who you're talking to. Our goal by the end of the first engagement is to set the baseline. So let's figure out what's working and what isn't, and then use that to inform our decisions moving forward.
Yeah. If I may, Clay, just to add a bit more, like the key one is, are you making money?
Yeah.
It's so obvious. If I may, and I apologize, I think I mentioned this last time we talked, but you and I have both done some work for a company called Rewind in the past. And, one of the things we got wrong when when I was working with them is we were selling to developers and we should have been selling into IT. And as soon as we changed the messaging and it reflected how IT buyers thought about the solution, it started changing a lot of things, right? You found the uptick that we were looking for. So, there's all sorts of reasons, as Tom said, that you might want to reevaluate. And a key one is your marketing actually working?
Yeah. We find that all the time. It's a sad conversation in a way, but you see marketing teams in our neck of the woods get gutted all the time because their ROI is so soft and they struggle to show how they're improving the bottom line of the company. And it can often be a hard thing to measure, but you've got to have some way of showing how, or eventually have a way of measuring the needle. And it's step one is figuring out what's the goal and how you measure it. And then step two is figuring out how you move it. I feel like sometimes those steps get skipped. Second question here. Have you seen any major differences on how different personas consume content in terms of like channels? I think I had this on my note sheet to discuss today. As we continue to talk, the more it was going to be similar to the other answers we provided, and that there's not a one size fits all, and you sort of have to know your audience. It's not like, hey, go to LinkedIn for leaders and then go to Reddit for end users. It's not going to be that simple. I'm sure you guys have a similar response here.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen surveys to technical audience that tried to understand this, and the discrepancies between the two were like 2-3%.
Yep.
Tom sort of mentioned a few minutes ago, like, yeah, humans are diverse in like how they approach these things and how they consume information. Customers always want me also to find out like what's the best channel. I always say there is none. There's directionally better places to go if you're a technical buyer versus someone who is, in human resources, right?
Yeah.
Like within that, yes, but they're both still on LinkedIn if they're business professionals.
Yeah.
Right. More often than not. So yeah, this is often like splitting hairs for me. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at trends. I think video has become almost a default way to communicate things quickly. But if you need technical documentation, are they going to watch a 10-minute video of like that? Probably not.
Yeah. I agree. Like directionally, there's probably paths you could take, like know your area. Like it's something I think gets overlooked in our space all the time. It's like newsletters tend to do shockingly well, and there's always a specific newsletter in the area that you do. But when it comes to like who's going to be where, like everyone's everywhere, man. I would give people multiple ways to digest your marketing and figure out who you are.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think of it, I think, for marketers historically is, before the internet, and I was alive then, you would have billboards, magazines, and bus ads all saying having the same campaign. It's no different now. There's even more places to put information. Software companies are still using billboards. They just take a photo of it now and put it on TikTok, right? Like I often tell people, don't get too hung up on this part of things.
Agreed. What's your take, Tom?
I find that a more useful mapping of content types. I agree with that. The fragmentation of awareness channels. When you start mapping different types of content along a buyer journey or a developer journey, and you understand the difference between discovery, awareness level content, and the deep core documentation or code samples or integration kits that are fundamental, and realize that they are operating at two fundamentally different stages of a journey that contains lots of dead ends and side quests. And that for me is a more meaningful vector along which to think about this. And then from that, you can start to think of, and none of this is going to be a a blanket rule for this. It will change on your organization. But if you have a solid understanding of your buyer journey and the likely handoffs between the different personas that we've discovered, be it developers or engineering team lead or CTO, then you can start to piece together this matrix view of what content is most useful at that stage in the funnel. But I would agree with you both and stop a long way short of prescribing that, yep, GitHub's going to be the place to reach that audience. Let's go all in on that. No, that's not a strategy.
I feel like probably the biggest piece of advice I could give is like the marketer understands the buyer journey usually. The rest of the people internally may not say that. It's not a conversation we have all the day when it's specific to content. Is like we'll send like a tofu top of funnel piece and like C-suite or internal SME will review it and they're like, why isn't this preaching our organization more? Like this should be like very, very bottom of funnel, like tutorial on how to use the product. And like all you're going to do there is capture people that are already aware. Like you got to have stuff that's like speaking to those other people that don't know who you are and like show that you're an expert in that area. And then, hey, by the way, you'll have that funnel drive them towards the stuff that's like, there's some other options out there. You can make life a lot easier. We constantly run into that. So I'd say, and unfortunately, the marketer, you got to learn how to be an educator internally and teaching people how this works.
It's tough though, because it's, and people don't think that buying the markets work that way. Like, if I may, there's good research that suggests that most savvy business professionals know what their options are in a market. They're just not in a high intent buying motion. And only 5% of a market at any given time is ready to buy. So even if you show them, here's how our product works, they already know it's there.
Yeah.
It just, the business conditions aren't there yet for them to prioritize investing in you for some reason or another. So showing them how the product works doesn't move anything further along.
Yeah. And those are people that are already like evaluating you as a consider like a serious. They're like, okay, how would we actually implement your product in our organization? They're already a qualified lead at that point. Whereas
absolutely,
you know, like
I think we just forget how long things take in B2B, because sometimes people are you could be in a consideration set for 2 years before a buyer actually invests in you. But your job is to stay top of mind during that 2 years as a marketer. And I think that's where a lot of people really struggle with, like, how marketing adds a value at the end of the day.
Well, guys, great as always. I love having both your organizations on our webinars. Thank you everyone for joining today. We do these monthly, so check out the website. Join us for our next one. Otherwise, Ryan, Tom, really appreciate you guys. Thanks for sharing today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. That was great.
Have a good one. See you.